Hello, and welcome to Fireside with a VC. My name is Andrew Romans, and we are blessed and lucky to have Charles Newhall III, Chuck, as the co-founder of NEA with us. NEA, for those that don't know anything about venture capital, is the largest venture capital fund in the world and truly unique in its, from inception, designed to last as long or longer than JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. So we're going to dive into that. Chuck is also a warrior. He served in Vietnam commanding an independent platoon. His decorations include the Silver Star, the Bronze Star. Less impressively, he received an MBA from Harvard University. Chuck is also the author of a new book, his third book, Dare to Disturb the Universe, which I have right here, which I highly recommend to anyone. As an author of books and one that reads them, this is truly one that belongs on every bookshelf. Chuck has also pioneered so many things at NEA, but also built up the biotech, drug discovery, medical device, and healthcare services business, and built that into a lasting institution. So Chuck, also third generation VC himself, and keep in mind he founded NEA in 1977 with Dick Kramlich, whom I know, and Frank Bonzel. So his father and grandfather were VCs, and his son, I believe, is the founder of Greenspan Associates, which Chuck has been involved with. So we're talking about 50 years of venture capital experience directly, plus pulling in his ancestors. This is like Eskimos who know how to navigate the stars, and we're really looking at over 100 years of venture capital experience around the the Thanksgiving dinner table. So extremely excited to be talking to you, Chuck.
Thank you very much. I've followed your career with interest, so let's get to it.
Okay, Chuck. So let's start our chat today at Hamburger Hill in Vietnam. I enjoyed digging into your book. Set the scene when you were on the battlefield with your men, and what was going through your mind when most of the guys on Hamburger Hill getting shot at that moment were probably dreaming of not being behind enemy lines and white picket fences back in the US safely with a family. What was going through your mind? Maybe take us to that point.
Sure. Actually, I lost half my men on that hill, but I have to go back a step further. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up. I thought about making a warrior career, but unfortunately, in the job part of it that I liked, special operations, you get out of a job by the time you're 35. And so that didn't seem like much of a future. But while I was at the University of Pennsylvania, I was an English major, and I was given independent study for the last 2 years at Penn, where I focused on the Romantic heroes' role in British and American literature in the late 19th and early 20th century, which I recommend highly for anyone wanting to go into a venture capital business, because what is it the study of? Entrepreneurial personalities, people who want to change the way the world is. Well, my father, as you mentioned, was a venture capitalist. He was hired by Lawrence Rockefeller in 1945 because he was the rocket man. It was his job to develop, produce, and allocate fighter aircraft. And Lawrence wanted to start something called the aerospace industry. He helped to start Eastern Airlines, McDonnell Douglas, Thiokol, iTech. I could go on just to name a few. But Father's company was called Reaction Motors, now called Thiokol. And it was a company that built the rocket engine. So one of the companies he was involved with was Reaction Motors, and I really looked upon that as changing the way the world is. So overhead, we could not be supported in Hamburger Hill by artillery fire. We were out of range, so we had to depend upon fighter jets. And my father's last company was called In-Flight Refueling, and it had a system for refueling fighter jets in close support of ground troops. which of course the Air Force didn't believe would ever be needed. Ground troops would never be used in another war. They wanted to use strategic air, and they had nothing to refuel fighter planes. Well, my father's system was overhead refueling the airplanes that saved my life on Hamburger Hill. So it was like an epiphany. I want to change the way the world is by being with entrepreneurs and the venture capital business, which I grew up in, even though I was a lowly English major and didn't know much about technology or biotech, just was where I was going to be in the future. And I devoted my life to it.
You know, when I read that story in your book, I thought of Pitch Johnson, and I'm sure you and Pitch have been on boards together, and Bill Draper. But Pitch has got a story of where he funded a kidney dialysis technology company and the founding CEO of that business. And you probably know it. I forget it. I wrote about it in my first book, talking to Pitch and Bill. But the founding CEO of this kidney dialysis machine came down with that same disease, and it was that machine that saved his life. So just like, imagine, you create this jet refueling business that saves your son and half his men's lives in Hamburger Hill. It's a circle of life story. It's amazing.
I know. I knew was involved with extracorporeal medical specialties. So the kidney dialysis was where I cut my teeth.
Okay. I thought that would be one. Well, moving forward in reading your book, and it didn't surprise me because I've grown up with New Enterprise Associates. NEA is this big bi-coastal firm that was there in the beginning of my career, and in Tyson's Corner in the Washington, D.C. area, as well as Silicon Valley. But you, Dick, and Frank really had designs for 100-year plus firm. It wasn't. Most VCs say my first fund is really a stepping stone to fund 3, 4, 5, but you guys were thinking fund 12 before you started fund 1. Maybe talk about why that was and what you did differently to go down that path.
And I might add our fourth generation of managing partners in the not too distant future. We've been through, transitions. I don't know why, because that's the way I think that you should found companies. You build things to last. And when we started out, I remember I used to go to these meetings we'd have at Silverado in California and say, how many of you here want to build a company that will be around for 50, 100 years? And 80% of them raised their hand. I don't think the same response would occur today, but that was what we grew up with. And it was very hard to do because partnerships had a fixed life. So you tend to think of it, well, in our case, we always started with 12-year partnerships, if you can believe, because we knew it was a long-term business. And we just wanted to create a venture fund that was unlike most, which basically would last for the partners. As I said, I forget who said it, Je ne regrette rien. Edith Piaf, I think. NEA was a 12-year partnership.
Right.
And so we basically had a longer time horizon than most. And so how do you create a firm that lasts when you have a short-term partnership? That was our challenge. And in order to do that, we had to give up 70% of the carried interest from the founder group to bring in the new people that were necessary to do that. And there was good news and there was bad news associated with the decision. The good news was we made the long-term decisions correctly, but we made a lot of mistakes and we had to make some partner changes along the way. But that's, what do you say? It's what happens when you build a company that you want to be around for a long term.
Well, I think it's interesting, rather than just tell victory lap stories, I think it's an opportunity for many emerging VC fund managers like myself and others and founders to learn from the experiments that you and Dick ran at NEA. For example, you've got a permanent long-term perspective, I think, just as a human, as a person. The 2 and 20 model, and I'd like you to explain the origins of where carry and carried interest come from. But then I want to bring back to a discussion of is that the right model for forever into the future? So maybe give us a foundation. Where does the term carry come from? And maybe explain the 2 and 20 model.
Well, it started in Phoenicia around the year 2000 BC. That was the way the Phoenician investor groups would fund the companies that they would send out across the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar up to England to trade. And they'd always send along a young member of the investor group. And that 80-20 model has been around for quite a while. You have to look at the venture business as an old business. I mean, I can say that were Ferdinand and Isabella venture capitalists, yes, when they funded Columbus, Marco Polo, but the whaling voyages used that same 80-20 formula. And then, of course, in around 1880, there was a guy by the name of Andrew Mellon at the Andrew Mellon Bank. And he started Gulf Oil, Carborundum, General Reinsurance Company as seed investments. So the business has been around. The 80-20 formula has been around. We actually never went with that 80-20 formula because we believed that the fees were the driving force that eroded a limited partner's rate of return. So we went with a 31 formula. We got 30% of the gains, but we operated on an expense budget, which for years kept our fees below 1%.
Wow.
And so we opted, and also, our limited partners sat as a board of directors over top of us. Now that has changed since that time, but we really wanted someone to report to, just the way that venture capitalists report to their board, of which VCs are a part.
That's very interesting because we've kind of had convertible notes have become the norm for early stage seed funding rounds. And they made a lot of sense when you've got lots of different angel investors. Let's just fund the company, avoid a long discussion on valuation. And when NEA comes in as the VC, we'll convert with a cap or a priced round. But then there's no board of directors with those. There's no governance typically in those terms of these convertible notes. So I think we need to start bringing in some board of director oversight into some of those early stage companies because we're going from the priced round preferred shareholder terms to that convertible note. But I thought that was fascinating that you guys had a board yourselves, when getting going with NEA.
Yeah, we basically strongly believed in governance, and we believed in being in partnership with the entrepreneurs. About 70 or 80% of our deal flow came from people that we'd done business with before and back before. So we were often talking to people that we'd worked with 2 and 3 times. Another thing that sort of gets confused is because NEA was a big firm that we weren't really focused on early stage. Well, our rule of thumb when we started was for every dollar that goes into a seed round, you need $8 to follow on. And the mistake we made was distributing too early our big winners and then not following on in follow-on rounds. So what led us to become big, and actually the suggestion for that came from Tom Judge, who ran the AT&T pension fund. Yep. And he said, I think you guys are beginning to do different things than when you first started out, which was just startup investing. You're really starting to do this venture growth expansion financing. So why don't you raise bigger funds? Okay, Tom, you want to finance it? He said, yeah, I'll put my hand up around the table. I might add that another thing when we started NEA was we brought all these people on to our board. And what did they become? They became the leaders of the fund-to-fund business. Mm-hmm. So the investors in NEA, one, provided 80% of the money for NEA 10, which was $1 billion fund.
Say that again. So the investors that were in NEA 1
provided
provided 80%.
provided $1 billion of a $2 billion fund for NEA 10. Excuse me, one investor did that. Our board of directors normally provided about 80% of any fund that we started.
Right,
now they're called the investment committee now, but once upon a time we called them our board.
So returning to the 80-20, when people refer to the 20% of the profit that goes to the managers of a fund, that's carry. And I think that goes back to that Genoa Mediterranean, thing of they carry, you get 20% of what you carry. So if you get the tea from China and you deliver that tea without dying all the way to England, to Southampton, you get 20% of what you carried. And that was,
I might add, it also was the same incentives that motivated privateers in letters of marque.
Oh, that's right.
They had a few of those in Baltimore too, along with carrying the China trade. We were an entrepreneurial city in those days, and we were the first to China and with trade goods, and the first back, and got the highest prices, which provided the basis for many long-term Baltimore fortunes. And then we also, during war, went out and sank English vessels and, robbed them and sold them for money on an 80-20 basis. Good game if you can get it.
That is amazing. That is amazing history. And with all the years of, the time delay from Series A venture financing to, say, IPO exit in the late 90s, in the dot-com height of telecom boom and all of that, was very brief, with people rushing the public for venture financing. So you had a short time delay. By the time the dot-com meltdown happened and we had nuclear winter, it was stay private forever. And you and I were talking about Barry Silbert and second market and the emergence of the secondary market. But do you think the 2 and 20 term, where the fund has 10-year term to extend to year 12, or with limited partner consent go further, does that make sense into the future? Is that still the right model from the Phoenicians, or do you see that as less than perfect?
I don't know. I think, as I say, we didn't go by the 80-20. We were 30 and 1.
Right.
So I think the only thing that is certain is change. Marcus Aurelius, excuse me if I go back to history,
Please.
Said everything is the result of change. And if you don't know history, then you really don't know anything. You're a leaf that doesn't know that it's part of a tree. So I think the idea of giving the people who are carrying or doing the management and venture a share of the gains is the right way. I think that the venture capitalists should invest in the same basis with some of to provide, the rule was 1% of the capital. How that formula is tweaked going forward is a matter of whatever it will take to get the job done. And I don't believe that remains constant. So the 80-20, the concept of it is good, but it's not a religious thing that should be put in stone like the 10 Commandments.
Yeah, I think that if you pretend to pay people, they pretend to work, and that's kind of the Soviet model. Yeah. And that you need incentive to get people to stay with you and to do their best. But I think that we may need a longer term view of when the VC fund is motivated to divest from a startup that it invested in. And so even talking about that, with all these funds that you've overseen, when you invested in a company, let's say you invested in Apple Computer, and then Apple has an IPO, you survive your lockup, you can now distribute cash or stock to your LPs. What's your perspective on the right time to make distributions? Or, if you had stayed in Apple Computer, you'd be in a multi-trillion-dollar company. But the venture capital model is sort of incentivized to distribute early.
Well, that's where we would change radically. for most of NEA's history, remember we started in 77, the real appreciation came post-IPO. So there was a time in NEA's history when our average holding period was 8 years and approached 10. Now, during the bubble, what should your average holding period be?
A lot less.
6 months.
Right.
I don't say that literally, but I meant there were a lot of companies that turned out to be not real that received very high valuations. And unfortunately, you know, when you're in a bull market, you not only think you can take bath in a water, but you think you can drink your own bath water too. And that's a very dangerous thing. But in the whole, I think NEA has always held the belief that you hold a company until no longer achieves a growth rate, which is attractive for a venture investor. So if you're fortunate enough to hold Apple, and that's another story, which I'll, if you want, I'll have to tell you about my English friend in Apple, and hold it, it offers a venture return for, you know, decade, and you ought to hold it. And that's why we went to the larger fund size, so we could continue to participate. And I don't know what the NEA current holding period is now, but I guess it's about to lengthen substantially.
That's right. That's right. And you know, we were talking about the secondary market when a founder, we invested in a company that was raising $15 million. Lightspeed came in with a big fund and did a $47 million financing. So that was only 15 of primary, the rest is secondary. You know, and this happens all the time now. Another company, one of ours, you know, we invest in these companies at like 8, 10, 12 million pre-money valuations for our first entry point. But another one raised, they wanted to raise 50 million as their last funding round before hopefully $1 billion exit. And there was a lot of appetite, and so they ended up raising 106 million. And so what that means is some of the founders are taking 10 million plus cash off the table while the company is privately held. They're less motivated to go down the IPO path or M&A, which is good and bad. It's good and bad, but but I'll tell you this, I think it means that the holding period for the definitive crystallizing and exit for the company of IPO or M&A is going to take even longer. And of course, with the stock market crashing, nobody wants to sell at today's multiples. Nobody wants to IPO. So it requires even more patience and strategy of how to make it work, in my view.
Well, I totally agree with that view. And that basically was a tenet upon which NEA was founded. Have you ever heard of a guy by the name of Ken Langone? He started out a home, I mean, he started a whole bunch of companies. He brought us a company called Home Depot. But you know what the average holding period for, he's one of the people I respect most in this business. His personal average holding period is 33 years.
And isn't that part of your anti-portfolio? I think they were in Atlanta and Home Depot pitched you. And did you end up making that investment, or that one got away?
Oh, I've started to quote or make up what I call venture capital proverbs. And I don't confuse these with the Bible. These are just pithy one sentence statements. And let me see. Don't consult erudite experts when you're financing paradigm shifts.
Right.
And Home Depot was an example of that. I really wanted to do the deal. And what they had was, of course, this company that was going to revolutionize the whole hardware business. They had consultants in the store, big, everything you could want, a totally different way of retailing. And one of my partners, not Dick, said, you know nothing about retailing. You got to bring some people in who know. And so I brought in two of my old T. Rowe Price buddies, that basically did specialty retailing. And I won't give their names, but they came to the conclusion that Home Depot was going to move from Atlanta to Los Angeles with its second store, way outside its span of control, never do it. And you never have leases like you did in Atlanta. Well, they were the experts, and I got outvoted. Didn't do Home Depot. Oh, and by the way, that's the first of many of those ships that we missed, or not the first, but among them. And what happened was Home Depot went to Florida next and did it in Miami, which was well within their geographic footprint. And lo and behold, they got better leases. So when you're going after something that hasn't been done before, people who are experts have a vested interest in maintaining that expertise, if you will, not in any bad way. It's just what they're incented to do. And so you've got to be able to think in terms of paradigm shift, which is just look around the corner and recognize that something that doesn't exist now will exist tomorrow. And that's something my good friend Jim Schwartz, who started Axel, often discuss.
Well, it was working with your team at NEA on the biotech and medical device equity exchange fund that taught me this, that I remember seeing a medical device. It was, I think, a disposable colonoscopy device. Mm-hmm. And I showed it to a buddy of mine from Georgetown, who is a MD, emergency room doctor, an MBA classmate of mine. And he goes, "Oh, no, that's not how we do it." And basically I could see that when you go to the expert, especially a physician, they are trained on what is safe and already approved by the FDA. And so they know what they use. And you say, "Hey, what do you think about this Phillips head screwdriver?" And they go, no. We only use the flathead screwdriver. That's what I'm trained on. That's what they taught me at Harvard Medical School. That's what we go with. And so your story of going to the expert, they're just going to tell you, what we use now and what's approved, and maybe struggle to understand what you as the non-expert potentially able to do. I think it's worth talking to those experts, but.
Well, let me give you a little perspective on that, because I had a great teacher. One of our investors was Merck, and I was good friends with the guy who developed cortisone, Lou Surrett, who was a legendary head of research for Merck. And we were looking at a little company that had a strange system of putting down a little wire down a vein and blowing a balloon up. And
stents, or the first stint?
Called balloon angioplasty, I think was the technology. And I was doing the research on this. And so I talked to maybe 100 experts, quote, and I talked to 50 of them who said, "God, this is the wave of the future. One day open heart surgery is going to be an outpatient procedure. This will be an outpatient procedure within about 2 or 3 years of adoption. You got to go this way." The other 50% said, "No way. The veins are going to occlude again. There will be restenosis, never be accepted." So I went to Lou and said, "What do I do?" And he said, "Flip a coin." I said, oh. They said, "No, that isn't what I'm asking you to do. What I'm asking you to do is see who has passion." Mm-hmm. Listen to those experts. And were some of them reading out of a textbook, or were some of them preaching to you? I tend to follow the preachers.
Yeah, I think, and we'll get to it later, but I know that NEA had these all day long Monday partner meetings where if it gets too democratic, it's hard for passion to outweigh, all the logic. And so it's sort of interesting to talk about what you've learned from investment committee and decision-making, or giving someone leeway to make a passionate investment, perhaps, that isn't fully onboarded by everybody else in the partnership. But maybe we talk about that now. So what happened? Because I think it's good for us to learn from what you did and what you would do differently, or what you think is a model for others to replicate. I think NEA had partner meetings with everybody sitting through every single investment, whether it was clean tech, healthcare, life science, or the IT
Oh, no,
side? No.
you got to remember NEA has been around for a few years. So what was the model when?
Okay.
Initially it was 3 people, then it grew. Eventually it grew quite large. And then we started running the teams, like the healthcare service team would have a meeting of maybe 6 people. And we would come up and recommend to the healthcare team that would go to the full partnership. And whenever, Scott Sandell, and can you imagine getting in that guy's way when he was passionate about something?
I think that guy looked like he had the mojo.
Dick Kramlich, we had a rule that if you were passionate, your other 2 partners stood aside.
Okay.
If you really were passionate. So Dick had this strange techie guy that worked at Xerox. He'd invented this communication system. And Frank and I went out to see him. I should know his name, but I have Parkinson's and prostate and PTSD, and my memory isn't what it should be. Very famous guy, as it turns out. And all he wanted to do was talk about communications in a very technical way. And his head of marketing, because Frank and I were sort of, what's the business guy doing? All he wanted to do was ask us about if we'd ever been to a debutante party in Baltimore and what a debutante party was.
Okay.
Well, we said, Dick, how can you finance this guy? He's trying to do something called a local area network. Dick said, I'm going to finance the guy. Are you with me? Oh, of course, Dick. That was 3Com. I think it was a 3Com park. I mean, wasn't that a baseball park that company eventually bought that was right outside of San Francisco?
Yeah.
That was the local area network, and it was created. Next thing happened is Dick introduced to the technical guy to a new CEO, and it was a new company. You're only one person away from a great company at any point in time.
Yeah, that's inspirational. And Chuck, what was the Apple story? I think you had an Apple computer story.
Oh, you talk about passion. You should have known this proper gentleman by the name of Anthony Montague. I might add, my son started his company. It was called Montague Newhall. But Anthony's son, Rupert, wanted to do other things, so it eventually just became Greenspring. But Anthony was the second son of Lord Montague. Well, his brother got 500 million pounds in the property between London and Bournemouth, and Anthony got a pair of shotguns because that's the way England works.
Second born.
Right. And so second born. So he had to start England's first venture capital firm. Well, he was a good friend of Arthur Rock's, and when Dick left Arthur, who was sort of the god of venture capital in the 70s, and people think he invented it, but that's just as Arthur took credit for everything. He didn't invent it, as we well have discussed, long before he was there. Anthony Montague, who's this proper guy, goes to this little company in California. Now, Anthony, you think he's this proper guy. He wasn't. He was a very intuitive person that fought an intuition. And although he had a partner, Peter Dix, each partner had the ability to make decisions they were passionate about on their own. So he visits this company, and it's in a little more than a garage, and he talks to the CEO, and he says, the 2 of them, there are 2 founders, and he says, I am not leaving this company until I invest. 20 minutes into the meeting.
I saw that.
All right. So they decide, well, this funny Englishman in a wool suit, and it's summer in California. They locked him in the company's headquarters, and they would feed him. And he was there 4 days, and he wouldn't leave it until someone sold him some stock. So I think the guy's name was Martucula, one partner. The other one was a guy by the name of Jobs. And Martucula, I'm not pronouncing it correctly, and my memory is fading, but he needed to buy a house. So he sold Anthony 4% of Apple for 10%, or 10% of Apple for $400,000.
but that's
Not a bad passionate decision.
yeah. I mean, he knew he was right. I mean, you hear people say, and then I slept outside of Walmart in the middle of wherever they are until I got the deal. Normally, that kind of hunger strike protest doesn't get you in, but that's amazing that
I
he
just
pulled
thought
that.
that's one of the funny stories of venture capital, which are worth repeating.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know, you're the founder of the Mid-Atlantic Venture Capital Association. I believe you're still chairman emeritus there. And so you've had the opportunity to pull together minds of other VCs and see what should our legislation say about things. You've got ordinary income tax and you've got capital gains tax, and you even have the qualified small business stock exemption of QSBS that, if LPs in my fund invest and we invest in a company and hold it for 5 years in a day, we pay zero tax on the first 10 million of gain or 10x what we paid for the stock. And there's an arbitrage between ordinary income tax and capital gains. Do you think that if investors in our venture capital funds no longer are getting capital gains tax treatment, that would hurt innovation and job creation?
Yeah, I'm a strong believer in capital gains. First of all, you have to remember that we never were paid a salary. We owed that money back. It was called our fee, and we had to pay it back with interest. So we lived off of one thing and one thing alone, and that was capital gains. I happen to be a strong believer in alignment of interest. What is the interest of the limited partner? Capital gains. What is the interest of the limited partner? Capital gains. What is the interest of the venture capitalist? The way the industry should be practiced? Capital gains, not fee income. So if you change taxing, and this is one of the reasons I wrote my book, Dare Disturb the Universe, was because I wanted to make sure that people understood the long-term nature of venture capital and how it was important to keep that capital gain incentives. It's not important to keep it for the leverage buyout business, which is called private equity. It's not important to keep it for hedge funds, but it is the life's blood of alignment of interest in the venture capital industry. You don't make money off of fees, you make it off of what the companies that you produce.
I couldn't agree more, because with the qualified small business stock exemption, again, if we hold the stock for 5 years in a day, there's a reward for being such a patient investor and a company builder, as opposed to the guy who algorithmically is selling a security that is a stock 15 seconds, or what do you think the average holding time is for these algo traders?
14.3 seconds, I believe, when I last studied the issue.
Yeah. So, I mean, if the only patience I need is that, I don't see QSBS ticking in, or 2 years or 3 years for the manager on capital gain. So, I think it is material. I often think it's a venture capital is more of a calling than an occupation, but it might be a calling for you and me, but we want to be able to raise money from LPs. And so I think that I was happy to see you talk about that in your book. Let's talk about board seats. I ran into Dick this time exactly, October last year, at an event in San Francisco. And I asked him, how many board seats should one individual venture capitalist be on? And I'll give you his answer at the end, but let me ask you the same question. What's the correct number of board seats that
you're looking for rules, and I don't believe in rules. Okay. That's my first mantra. You should be on as many board seats as so long as the president of every board that you sit on votes that you're the most valuable member of his board. In Dick's case, that was 23 at one point in time.
Okay.
Now, how did he do it? He drove to 3 board meetings a day. I happen to live in Baltimore, and if you ever make a mistake of investing in Parkersburg, West Virginia, it takes a day to almost 2 days to get there and back, at least when I was, starting my adventure career, and I think they still flew you around in biplanes or whatever it was we used in those days. No, I think even I was on 18 at one point in time, but I don't think that if you ever interviewed my CEOs, which our limited partners did, they would ever accuse an NEA partner of not being involved. Now, the other thing is, what stage are the company in their life cycles? We often would stay on the boards well after we distributed the stock, because being on that board often was where we got our deal flow.
Yeah.
And you don't know how many entrepreneurs, if you're in a category killer company and you stay on that board, category killer companies are often aware of what's going on in creating other category killers in their basically sector of the woods.
Yeah, I remember we were talking about my startup in DC in Tyson's Corner, and Jack Kemp was on our board.
Yeah.
And Jack was also on the board of Oracle at the time, which was interesting to us that we had Lucent backing us. And if he could bring Larry Ellison in, that was good. So being a board member of Oracle made him attractive to me as a board member for my startup, at the time. Let's talk a little bit about some East Coast, West Coast stuff. I know that you and Dick were flying back and forth a lot, so neither of you were pigeonholed into one geography, but, what do you think about, Route 128 in Boston and how San Francisco kind of became the big one, and then Boston kind of became Kendall Square for pharmaceutical, but not so much IT. Maybe give your perspective on why certain parts of the country became the core ecosystems and others not as much or faded over time.
Oh boy. Well, I think there are a whole bunch of reasons that you become an ecosystem. You have to have a good academic community that spins out technology. I think the most important thing is you got to get an entrepreneurial community going. And why does entrepreneurship work in San Francisco? And it didn't work, at least when I did it in Parkersburg, West Virginia, or tried it. Because in San Francisco, if you're a devoted small company person, you can go down the street and get a new job. But in Parkersburg, West Virginia, so what I call the critical mass of entrepreneurial companies in a region for it to work. And those companies in turn would spin out others. Excuse me, I have a pug dog that's barking. It will just take a second to let him go.
No problem.
Sorry about that.
No problem. I know you've got a book about pug dogs, don't you?
Yeah, that's the Chronicles of Stanley the Pug, because I even talk to dogs. They give me a lot of wisdom. The pugs have been around forever. I mean, they're a breed that the Chinese developed over 3,000 years, so they have a lot of wisdom.
Let me remind me, that'll be my last question. It actually is my last question about your other books, but
yeah. Then I was saying, to make an entrepreneurial region, you need a whole bunch of ingredients. You got to get the infrastructure. Silicon Valley Bank. What bank in Baltimore would lend to a startup company? None. Silicon Valley Bank had to move into the Mid-Atlantic before a whole bunch of the other local banks started really becoming aggressive lenders. Lawyers, all the people that support the startup network, that has to be created in a region. Actually, I devote a chapter in my book to what it takes to create a region. So I'm going to say to all your readers, if you want to hear the rest of the answer, read the goddamn book. Excuse me.
I know. I remember I've written some books, and even Bill Draper, when he gave me a copy of his book, he signed his saying "from one author to another," which I thought was really classy. But there's certain countries have just stopped reading books. Like, I don't want to out the ones that have completely stopped. The French will always buy books. In everyone's apartment, There's one
Right.
room that's floor to wall to ceiling, all books. But it is important to go into those ecosystem elements. And everybody wants a Silicon Valley in their patch of the world or their part of the country. And I think your book highlights some good things. So we can leave that for the book. When I was reading your book, having been an entrepreneur in the mid-Atlantic in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, I hadn't seen FBR in a long time, Freedom's Billing and Ramsey's. They were kind of like a local four horsemen, at the time. They even had they had a bank, but they also had a venture capital practice. Maybe I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the four horsemen of whether it was the formal, was it
Well, it was in the old days, it was Alex Brown, Hambrecht and Quist, Unterberg, Tobin,
Tom
Tommy
Swizel?
Weissel,
Right.
and they were the four horsemen. And then basically what happened is the economics in the business changed. You couldn't make money following the research for small companies, and the whole dynamics as we started to get into the unicorns started to change in the investment banking business, and the four horsemen decided to become money managers. And they all sold their brokerage business and then went into the investment management business. And, like Brown Advisory is still going strong. Alex Brown is history.
Well, it's a shame. I think, the four horsemen were dynamic people. I once had dinner with Bill Hambrecht, and he said to me, I don't know how you could have a really great venture capital fund without an investment bank. And I don't know how you can have a great investment bank without a venture capital fund. And for some reason, we had them both, and they were very symbiotic, and they work great. I think of GP Bullhound in Europe, out of London, as kind of going down that path of they started doing advisory work, and then they got into M&A, and then they have their own co-investing funds.
Well, I think when you add part of that soup, the ingredients for the soup of an entrepreneurial environment is definitely entrepreneurial investment banks that can work in a symbiotic relationship with the venture capital industry, which is why I like Bill Hambrecht's quote.
Yeah. I mean, we have a bunch of small LP investors that are M&A, sell side, boutique investment banks. Sometimes they invest out of their LLC partnership, so they're all kind of equally in, and sometimes they come in individually. But I personally love to talk to those guys about what do you think an exit would look like for this company. We're contemplating making an investment now, and their perspective is very welcome to us of trying to figure out what kind of multiple could we make and what's going to take to get from here to an exit, for a company like that. So I think even the culture of the individual people, like Tommy Weissel proliferating into his organization, is what made that one of the four horsemen. And, Bill Hambrecht.
Absolutely. I can remember I'm going to spend this weekend with my good friend Jim Blair, who was one of the four horsemen of the biotech business, along with Brooke Byers and Tony Ebnen and Venrock. And I think it was Chuck Weinberg of Channing Weinberg. You're straining my memory. But he spent a good bit of time in the brokerage business. And he said, as an analyst, before he is a PhD, like in microbiology and electrical engineering. He's one of those people who are disgustingly technically capable in all fields. And he said, well, that may be all well and fine, but the most valuable thing I learned was when I was working as an analyst. And that was what, making something that someone would buy.
Okay, there you go.
And he said, you are a company builder, but you also have to be able to make sure that someone is going to buy what you're building. You don't want to have the best laser when no one is buying lasers or won't buy them. This is back in the 80s. They said the laser business would be enormous by the year 1980. Well, it wasn't.
Yeah,
that's a whole other story. But the point is, you got to, not only build for the long term, but you have to build things that you can raise money.
Absolutely. I think there's a milestone, raise some money, hit a milestone, open a new gate, raise
Right.
some money, hit some milestones, open a new gate. Y Combinator, as they're famous for the mantra of talk to customers, build things, talk to customers, build things, make things that people want, make something people want. And it's a simple message to a young entrepreneur, but it goes back to your wisdom of, don't just make lasers because you think Gartner Group said the market's going to be this big in, the year or whatever.
Let me tell you another story about Dick Kramlich. It's on that same point. He invested in this little company called Macromedia,
Oh, sure.
and
Yeah.
so
Everybody used that for making websites. I had Macromedia on my
PowerPoint.
computer.
Anyway, the guy who starts it was a businessman. The first product blows up, second product blows up. Dick wants to keep on financing it. Businessman leaves. There's an English major who was his partner, and all he's been doing is calling customers and finding what they want, and develops a company called PowerPoint.
Ah, okay.
And that
So,
was how PowerPoint, and then Microsoft bought it, and the rest is history.
I mean, people talk about the consultative sale where you're kind of consulting, finding out what the functional requirements are, bringing it back to engineers, maybe getting funding, that talking to customers and asking what they want. Even with an economic downturn, if large companies want to get back to their knitting and they get rid of some side projects and some of those people are talking to customers and then they talk to VCs, that could be the next PowerPoint being born. Right now we're kind of seeing that with Canva and some of these online.
No, the customer is where it begins and it ends.
So just a few more questions for you we could talk about today. You mentioned Kleiner Perkins being different from NEA in your book. Is there anything you'd want to talk to us about that today?
Well, I think Kleiner Perkins was was a very good firm. I think it was too fee based, oriented on 3% and 25. And also, I think it was a star system as opposed to a partnership of a band of brothers. And I don't think that model works as long as the model that we had. And I think that's what history has shown.
Yeah.
I think the stars go away and the luster's not as bright, and they perhaps miss the next new thing, as Jim Clark used to call them.
Yeah, Jim Clark from Silicon Graphics and Netscape and well.
CFO and et cetera, et cetera.
And with I think one of the interesting things to take away for me is I've always thought when I bring in a new GP to our fund, that person gets equal economics to me, even if I was the founder and they come in after a lot of LP capital has been raised. But you guys, as the three founders of NEA, handing over 70% of the carry to the next generation, that's inspirational. Maybe you've already touched on that, but by what fund?
I said there were good decisions and there were bad decisions, and that is we handed over too much of the carry to people that were not productive. I think NEA increasingly has gone to a system that if you grow your own, the carried interest grows with them. And then, but of course, you always break your rules when you hire a superstar that comes in, and let's say that the person is, I got to remember that, 4 of my 23 healthcare partners, when I left NEA, had $500 million because they'd been successful entrepreneurs. And you tend to bring those people in on an equal basis.
Well, I think I remember you writing about this in your book that you would think that NEA can attract these healthcare superstar CEOs that had $500 million exits. But then when you had to manage a band of Captain Kirks that each one thinks he's Captain Kirk and there's 5 of them, maybe share with us what you mentioned in your book about managing too many superstars.
Managing cats. Have you ever tried to manage a cat?
That's what I do with my LPs, I guess. But yeah.
Well, cats in our case were partners.
Right.
I mean, so the answer is it's difficult.
Right.
And
Right.
it takes an organization that is very much devoted to the long term and attracts. We always would give young partners very big carried interest plays, and then their salary would be about a third of what they could get other places.
Okay.
So we tended to attract entrepreneurs who believe that same thing, and we attracted partners, and it became a wonderful recruiting tool for us, because if we didn't have someone who bought into that culture, they clearly were better off going to a place that was not NEA.
Sure. I mean, it aligns that long term.
And there are many ways to skin a cat. I don't say that NEA had the only winning formula. There are 100 winning formulas.
Yeah, and NEA happened to. I mean, I've had Alan Patrikoff on the podcast, going from Apex getting very big down to Graycroft attempting to stay small. But there may be many models, but NEA is the largest truly early stage investor with growth financing, not just a publicly traded or buyout PE firm. So I mean, I think that says something about your model. Going from being a warrior in the US military to fundpreneur, founder of a VC fund and longtime VC, what are some lessons learned of getting our military veterans into tech startups? If you look at the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, they seem to create a lot of startup success out of their military, and their military is different than ours. Do you have any thoughts on kind of harnessing veterans or experience of working with military folks in your own?
Well, the reason I went into venture capital is because it's a life and death situation. It's like combat. It's the only business that is like combat. Military background certainly has been incredibly invaluable for me as a venture capitalist. My partner, Vin Prothro, who is a great entrepreneur and venture capitalist, said you have to learn to eat the reality sandwich. And as a combat leader, you have to eat the reality sandwich. So as a combat leader, you're forced to eat the reality sandwich, i.e. dramatically changing at conditions, or your life will be interrupted by a piece of lead in your head. And so that's very good training for an entrepreneur, which I call broken field running. But at the same time, there's another aspect to the military mind. And there was a company, little startup called Federal Express. And they decided that the guy by the name of Fred Smith, who nothing more was an old military guy and a flyboy, couldn't really run a business. So they brought in a four-star general who happened to be the one that I volunteered five times for Vietnam. They wouldn't take me, and I had to pull strings, and this was the guy that pulled the strings. But he had a military mindset that it has to be done this way. And I know the guy at Citicorp who cast the vote that put Fred back in charge of the company, which of course was the making of the company. So like everything, like the internet, like all these technologies, there's always a good and the bad. And there's a good side to the military background, which is the combat side, being able to change immediately to dodge right, dodge left, and find the winning strategy. And then there's a bad side, which is this is the way we do it in the U.S. Army.
Right. Well,
and or the Air Force in the case of General Estes, who was, by the way, it used to be that you only flew 25 missions over Berlin because 90% of the planes were shot down. He started his career by flying 95.
Well, it doesn't take a stretch of the mind to think the guys that could run the Berlin airlift could figure out how to build FedEx into a on-time
No,
delivery.
no, this guy, he was bombing Berlin.
I know. I followed. I followed you. I was just changing gears for
Yeah, but
a
anyway,
flyboy, a flyboy, and a
he
general.
ran military air transport, which was nothing more, they thought, than a big FedEx. But Fred was the guy that had the passion and took the company on to the great heights. And I think it was right to change management. So, as I say, good and bad.
Could you tell me the story about UUNet? I mean, UUNet at one. I mean, maybe just start. How did you guys find your way to UUNet, or how did UUNet find you guys?
Well, I think Axel mentioned to Peter Barris that there was this company in Washington that was somewhat similar to GE Information Systems. And so Peter went out there and just fell in love with it, as did the whole partnership, because one of our consultants one time in the early 80s or late 70s put on this big television screen and we surfed the net. We went to a Swedish professor's house, and I think everybody realized that, God, if you could do this in business, it would be transformational. So Adams was one of these extraordinary guys. He built up a $3 million business. One half of it was internet, $1.5 million revenues. But Peter went in there and said, GE Information Systems is the model. We got to go to the business customer, not the consumer, which was what most of the early internet companies were going after. And by the way, I know John Sidgmore, who was running GE Information Systems, or at least a crucial part of it. I know his ops guy, and I know his customer service. And if you like those guys, they'll be your management team. Adam said yes, and Sidgmore started the ground running. And he built that company into a multi-billion-dollar business. And he had, I think it was 75% of the traffic over the internet.
That's
so
right. Yeah.
Or didn't start the internet. Commercially, it was created by Peter Barris and the team that was led by John Sidgmore.
Yeah, and that was back when billion-dollar valuations didn't really exist. So that was an absolute.
Who brought the company its first major customer? Dick Kramlich, because he'd founded one of the big communications box companies that became UUNet's first customer and provided all of their hardware for the backbone. And that was what helped get UUNet started. So it was again a team effort, very much by the whole partnership going behind Peter and the management team. But its story has a sad ending because John Sidgmore loved his employees, and he basically resigned, gave it up to go back, start another company after it was bought by MFS, and it then went to a company called WorldCom.
Right.
And Sidgmore came back because he loved his employees to run WorldCom, and that ended up killing him.
Okay.
But he did take WorldCom out of chapter and save the surviving company. And so anyway, one of the blips along the road.
Yeah. I mean, this is where it is like combat. I know a couple guys that didn't survive, that have not survived their company. So as a VC, one needs to be very sensitive to how these founders have all their eggs in one basket sometime, and they're under a lot of pressure from all sides. Do you remember John May? I saw at the Mid-Atlantic Venture.
Yes, I do remember John May.
Wasn't he?
Yeah, he was, well, I started something called the Mid-Atlantic Venture Association, and John was intimately involved with the creation of that. When we started it, there were no venture deals in the Maryland area. I think there were like 4. When we left, I think the Mid-Atlantic Venture Association had about 110 venture firms, and we had as many venture-backed companies in the Mid-Atlantic as we did, or as the Boston did, in a similar geographic area. So it was quite interesting to try to get region that hadn't been pro venture capital to at least tolerate it.
Yeah.
But we had three things. We had biotech, we had communications and software. Biotech and communications fell off the board, and we were left with just the software. But it's still a pretty vibrant region.
But I want to talk about your other books, but just want to show this copy of the book. It's Dare Disturb the Universe, a memoir of venture capital, written by Charles W. Newhall, Chuck Newhall, founder of NEA, and absolute one of the must-own books for anyone who wants to understand where we're coming from, where we are, where we're going. Chuck, tell us about your other two books. I think we saw your dog. If anyone's watching this video, we saw a dog come and go in the middle of this podcast, but tell us about your other two books, please.
Well, Fearful Odds is my book about Vietnam and my first wife's suicide. And it's how to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, told as a war story about my combat. And it comes from a quote, like most of my books do: a man cannot die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his country and the temples of his gods. And I've sold 40,000 copies of it.
Wow.
And Saul Snyder, who was a great MD, PhD, psychiatrist, neurobiologist, said it is the best work available for dealing with depression. And it's better than Sylvia Plath or one of those books that account what it's like to overcome or suffer from that particular ailment.
Oh, wow. I'll be sure we'll put a link to this book and both of your books or all three of your books in the show notes of this podcast. So if you're listening, we'll be able to click and link it from Spotify or wherever.
There's another book too, which is called Brightside Gardens, which is a dialogue between the head and the heart. And one of the ways you deal with, depression is by having outside interests that you're passionate about. And for me, the garden was. It's hard being married to a venture capitalist. I told my second wife when I married her, you have to know before you marry me that I have a mistress. She said, really? What's her name? Or I said, my mistress is venture capital.
Right. And she can knock it any hour of the day.
Mm-hmm. And I have many children with her, and those children are demanding. And so just know that when you marry me, that mistress is going to be part of your life. And of course, I'm an entrepreneur, you're an entrepreneur. I mean, we are venture capitalists, but we've also started businesses and been involved with the creative, and that just comes with the territory.
Yeah.
That's part of your DNA.
Well, Chuck, this has been a wonderful session. I think that for the next one, I'll jump on an airplane and we can sit down together and capture some more stories. This has been a true pleasure. I really appreciate you writing these books. I know it's one thing to write a book. It's another thing to finish a book. And you don't want to finish it with your name on it, without it being just right. So thank you for that effort of getting it done. And I hope to talk to you again very soon.
I hope to buy you a nice, share a nice bottle of wine with you. That's another one of my hobbies. So.
Okay. Well, you have me at hello. So Chuck, you've closed me again. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.